Okay, we are live. Good evening, and on behalf of Nandini Voice for the Deprived Chennai, a very warm welcome to today's webinar on Has the movement for empowerment of women benefited the women who are less educated and those who live below the poverty line? There is no tool for development more effective than the empowerment of women. When women thrive, all of society benefits. These are famous words from the former Secretary General of the United Nations, Kofi Annan. And yet, after almost 74 years of independence and all the development that India has seen through manifold increase in agricultural output, industrialization, explosive growth of the service sector, liberalization, and the IT boom, have we been able to accrue the benefits of this progress in fair measure to the lowest of the lower rungs of our society, the women who live below the poverty line? To enlighten us on this issue, we have some eminent speakers with us today. Firstly, I'd like to invite Sri N.S. Venkatraman, Trustee, Nandini Voice for the Deprived, to give his opening remarks, please. Mr. Venkatraman.
Thank you, Ms. Shamla Vaidyanathan. See, the empowerment of women is a subject that has been under animated discussion for several decades now. It's a fact, ground reality is there has been a substantial improvement in the status of women and in empowerment of women all over the world. This has been possible mainly due to the proactive measures initiated by several world governments, the positive campaign by the social activists and the media personnel to a large extent. While this is a fact, if one would take a holistic view of the entire scenario, he would come to the conclusion that the empowerment of women probably has taken place more amongst the women in the affordable income group as well as the educated women. To the same extent, the empowerment of women has not taken place among the women in the lower income group or less educated women. In the world today, in developing countries, significant section of the population belongs to lower income group, in which women is a substantial part. So when we find a scenario where the women from the lower income group are not benefited by the empowerment of women to the same extent as the educated women and the women in the affordable group, it's a matter of concern. Why is this situation? What is the reason behind this? Is it the fact that the government proactive measures are inadequate, or social activists have not played the role adequately well, or the media has not exposed the cause? Or ultimately, is it possible that the women in the lower income group and less educated women who are poor and vulnerable are not allowed to get the empowerment by the men around them? These are all questions that require a very detailed answer. We got two eminent thinkers here with us, Mr. Sachin Nair and Professor Shushila Kaushik, and both of them have done a lot of work on the research and investigation with regard to women's issues. I'm sure both these eminent thinkers have got a lot of original views on the subject and their suggestions to make. I think their considered views and enlightened ideas will give a clear way out for us to formulate our suitable policies for the future. All of us are looking forward to hear these two eminent speakers. Thank you.
I'd like to now introduce our next speaker, Sri Sachin Nair. Sri Nair is the Director, Press Institute of India, Chennai. Press Institute of India is a not-for-profit organization that was founded in 1963 for the development of standards of journalism in India. It conducts workshops on development journalism, women empowerment and child rights, national security, foreign policy, and plain writing, reporting, editing. Sri Sachin Nair is also the editor of two journals, namely Vidura and Grassroots, both focusing on social development issues. He's also a very well-known and highly respected journalist. We're very privileged to have Sri Sachin Nair with us today. Over to you, Sri Nair.
Thank you very much, Shobana, for that introduction. And thank you very much, Mr. Venkatraman, for inviting me to this program and asking me to say a few words. I'm not an expert on the subject, but as an editor and a journalist over several years, we've, of course, done various stories on social development issues, on issues relating to girls, to women and children. And now as the editor of Vidura and Grassroots, we also receive several stories from writers across India, which sort of gives a broad picture of what women still undergo in India. As Shobhita mentioned, 74 years after independence, things haven't changed very much among the marginalized. It's very difficult to start talking on a subject like this because there is so much to say, and the starting point is always difficult. But by coincidence or whatever, I was reading a book, and there I was reading about a woman called Tarabai Shinde. I don't know how many people have heard about her, but Tarabai Shinde was born in a place called Berar in rural Maharashtra. She was a Marathi woman, and Ramchandra Guha in his book mentions Tarabai Shinde as one of the makers of modern India. And why? I'll come to that. So Tarabai was, like women in the villages in those days. This is the 1830s, by the way. Was a middle class family. Her father was a clerk in government service. There is little about her history of her early life, but it is likely that she did not attend school. She did her learning from home. But significantly, Tarabai was actually known because she directly challenged the social arrangements and cultural prejudices that underpinned patriarchy and male domination. I'm reading from the book. And why am I referring to Tarabai here? I'll just quote a few lines from what she has written. She became famous for a 52-page book. That's all. The whole book is only 52 pages long, but the prose is very powerful prose that hits you. It was in Marathi, but translated into English. I'll just read a few lines that will give you a flavor of what we are talking about. So here goes. This is Tarabai Shinde. A father and mother make you the gift of their daughter once and for all. They pour the water over your hands, and that's the end of it. Then she leaves, and she's lost to them. Oh, the pity of it. From the day of her birth, her father and mother have followed their natural feelings and raised her up from child to adult with praise and love, each as best as they could. See how hard they work to get her a place that's good and happy, to please her new family of in-laws, in the hope that they love her and treat her kindly. If good luck's on her side, everything's fine. But what if it isn't? All her life long, her mother and father have cherished her, dear as life is itself. What must it be like her? What must it be like for her, whose father and mother never gave her the lightest slap when she feels the sharp blows of your fist on her back? What must her parents feel? If I wrote down the raw truth, it would fill up a book as big as the Ramayana. And when you do treat a woman well, it's usually only just for show. And then she goes on. Women in this world are forever putting up with all sorts of hard toil. It's across the world. Difficulty, hunger and thirst, harassment, and beatings. And all they ask is a kindly word from you. It's true. You go out and earn the money, but she has to see to the running of the house, has to do exactly as you tell her. Perpetually obedient, kept in ignorance, toiling at the most exhausting work till her body's pleasure breaks into little pieces. Her bones waste away and her blood turns to water. Her eyes always on your face. You've only got to glance at her approvingly and flash your teeth in a smile, and she feels its joy divine. This encourages her to take up the burden of labor again, to learn and to do even more kinds of work. So that's from the book. So that gives us a broad picture of what women in India then, and she mentions across the world, so not very different, certainly from our neighborhood and other countries. What women in the then in the 1830s or the 1880s, the book was incidentally published in 1882, were facing. When you sit back and think about it, it's not very different from what several women in India today, at least, and in several other countries face even today. Except, as Mr. Venkatraman mentioned earlier, except for the more elite, within quotes, the elite, or the well-to-do, or the well-bracketed, or the rich, women who come from such a society, they might have improved a lot over the years, but not the women we are talking about today. And when we say marginalized women, it's not just women in rural India or in India's heartland. There are marginalized women in our own cities and towns, in the metros. The maid that comes to work at our home could well be marginalized. The flower seller, the fruit seller, the woman who helps the ironman deliver the ironed clothes to our houses, the woman who cleans the toilets and the floors in hotels, the woman you find at a construction site in your city. All these people are marginalized. So it's not just that we talk about women in rural India who are marginalized. They are, of course, far more marginalized because they don't have access to things we take granted for in the cities. The distance, the lack of connectivity, the lack of communication, the lack of the internet in today's world, all that adds to the woes of women in rural India. So, of course, the situation is far worse. So, what is the picture that comes to one's mind when you talk about a young girl in, let's say, in a remote village, somewhere in India, in Orissa, in Bihar, why even in Tamil Nadu, or maybe somewhere in Maharashtra? It's about a small girl who is playful, of course, but is more often than not, malnourished because she doesn't get the food that she has to take. So there's malnutrition. She often cannot go to school because either the family cannot afford to send her or there is no school in the vicinity. Even if she is lucky enough to go to school, she can go to school only up to a certain stage because there are no toilets there. So once she reaches puberty, etc., the family will not allow her to continue. Or the girl is asked to take care of her younger siblings and help her mother fetch the water, and she has to trudge miles. She also has to walk a long distance to collect firewood. And once all that is done, and she still hasn't enjoyed anything in life as yet, they say it's now time to pack her off. So it's about early marriage. A lot of these things still happen in our villages. So it's early marriage, and the girl doesn't even know anything about marriage and life after marriage. And after marriage, if, as Tarabai Shinde says, if she's lucky, it's fine, things are fine. But what if she's not lucky? So there's exploitation, there's abuse, of course, there's dowry harassment, and all kinds of things that we read in our papers, even today. So we talk about government programs, we talk about movements, we talk about the non-governmental organizations, individuals. There is no doubt that there has been substantial improvement from the Tarabai Shinde days to what we are witnessing today. There is no doubt that there has been substantial improvement in the condition of women. But there is still a large majority that suffer many of these problems. Large number of marginalized women, young girls who suffer many of these problems. Let's flash forward it to, let's say, 1979. 4 decades have passed. We are now in 2021 since the adoption of the UN Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, CEDAW, which was ratified by more than 180 countries in 1979. 42 years later, what are we seeing? Has there been substantial change? We also had the Grand Platform for Action at the 4th World Conference on Beijing. Professor Sushila can correct me if I'm wrong. I think in 1995, which was attended by a record 36,000 women from around the world, and it was adopted there. Flash forward even further, we had the UN Women's 2018 flagship report, which was titled "Turning Promises into Action: Gender Equality in the 2030 Agenda." The agenda being the 2030 Agenda for the Sustainable Development Goals, and it's which was adopted by the world leaders in 2015. So the broad question here again is: have UN conventions or legal statutes really helped marginalized women? Is it rhetoric or is it reality? We must also remember, or perhaps it's better to say the other way, that we cannot forget that India continues to confront the added challenges of violence against women. I'm not even talking about the horrendous, Nirbhaya story. And there are numerous other Nirbhaya stories that keep unfolding at regular intervals. Maybe we don't see many of them today, after COVID, but it's all there. We all know for a fact that a majority of women in India has experienced some form of sexual violence in either public or private spaces. And sadly, about a third of these crimes, that have been reported against women in India has been due to either cruelty, anger, cruelty, call it what your physical violence, by her husband or relative. So it's all indoors, which makes the situation even far worse. The government has identified violence against women as a key national priority, which of course resonates with the Sustainable Development Targets of the United Nations on gender equality. That's fine. The Prime Minister's, the Beti Bachao and Beti Padhao initiative. You teach a girl, and and then things change for the family. It aims at equal opportunity and education for girls in India. I'm sure there are similar programs elsewhere in other countries in the world, at least in our neighborhood. Then there are programs like the Sarva Shiksha Abhiyan and legislation such as the right to education. They are all supposed to help, drive up, increase the enrollment for girls. All fine for the books, but how well does all this translate on the ground? I don't know whether any comprehensive survey has been conducted on let's say the Sarva Shiksha Abhiyan, because we had COVID the last 2 years, so we can't even do a proper survey. But we will know in the years ahead whether it's proved fruitful for girls. I'm not going to mention about the Me Too accusations, or the Me Too accusations, or we have this movement called Me Too across the world. It also resonated in India. There were a lot of women who came forward, named men who had abused them years earlier. We know the story, but I'm not going to mention it here because all these are women who had the ability to voice their their opinions out loud. They had the power or the position and the resources to bring people to book. But can a marginalized woman ever do this? I don't see this happening. Even molested her. So I'm not going to go into that at all. Today, in the midst of COVID, there is a UNICEF report, and we all know for a fact, and newspapers have reported also, that COVID, apart from the physical trauma and the mental trauma and the medical aspect of it, why? Because women cannot travel. There are pandemic care, social services, or community support. There is no one to come to her aid if she's, being wanted to. Gender-based violence, all this has increased. There's domestic violence. There are news reports about domestic violence that has increased during the pandemic. Also, as schools and colleges remain closed, forget colleges, as schools remain closed, marginalized girls or girls from marginalized families are more likely to drop out of education and not return. Job losses, increased economic insecurity will also force families in marginalized communities to marry off their daughters because they feel it's easing the financial burden. So these are new dimensions that are coming to the fore, things we've not handled before, perhaps, in such a large context. How are we going to deal with this? So the million-dollar question is, how do we solve these problems? Is the government alone to be blamed for what the women lack or find the situation that they are in? NGOs are doing a good job. The government is doing its bit, but a lot more can be done by the government. There is no doubt about it. So where do we start? Also, isn't it time that we also try and restore some dimensions of ethics and morals into our daily lives? It could be families, it could be elders in the family, it could be family members, teachers, maybe community leaders. And the empowered in terms of psyche, at least in terms of psyche about gender equality, they know. But the boys don't. Also, does part of the problem lie in breaking social barriers? There's stigma attached to girls doing certain things. How do you dismantle rigid, very rigid beliefs and superstitions? How do you create empathy? How do you get boys or men to empathize with women? So it is abundantly clear that we need major changes in social perception. It has to come from within. There has to be a change in mindset. I don't think the government can do that alone, because you can't have, you can have laws, but you can't walk into somebody's home and try to change somebody's attitude. If all that is a very bleak picture, I must also mention that, at least as an editor, I do receive several stories that are inspiring stories about women who are doing very well, marginalized women who are doing exceptionally well in several parts of India. For example, in Orissa, women in marginalized families are bearing the brunt after the cyclone hit. I was just going through, one or two of our earlier issues to have a look. Tribal women in Chhattisgarh are raising the bar on nutrition and health. they are trying to dispel myths and misconceptions. Not alone, of course, they have the backing of an NGO or maybe some government agency, but they are doing it together without the help of men. Women in a village in Himachal Pradesh are fighting and winning the battle against solid waste dumping. In a village in Rajasthan, a project seeks to include more women with limited literacy skills to monitor groundwater and bridge the gender gap. So there are men involved, but women are also being made a large part of that program, and they are happy to be a part of that program. In Sindhudurg, it's a place in southern Maharashtra, women are protecting mangroves by trying to encourage eco-tourism. So there are several examples. I don't want to go into any more. What I want to emphasize is that there has been substantial change, but we have a long way to go. Unless women are given freedom, and freedom that just doesn't mean, giving them money, giving them jobs, or, it means the freedom to speak out, to voice their opinion, to be able to decide. You needn't decide for them. They are capable of deciding for themselves. They are capable of choosing what they want. Let us hear what their opinion is. Unless we allow women, we meaning society at large, and this spans across not just India but across countries, unless women are allowed to realize their potential without fear. There should be no fear. They shouldn't be fearful while doing so. Unless they are allowed to realize their potential without fear, society, I feel, will not be able to progress fast. We will still be stuck in this rigmarole. And I'm sorry, but even the UN SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, will remain a distant dream if we don't take action, and take action now. I think I've spoken enough. Shobana.
Thank you, Sri Nair. Our next speaker is Professor Sushila Kaushik from New Delhi. She's a former professor and head of Department of Political Science at Delhi University. She studied at the Columbia University in New York and the Vanderbilt University in Nashville, United States. She's a recipient of the Fulbright Fellowship as well as a senior Fulbright ACLS grantee. She is a founder of Center for Development Studies in New Delhi, an NGO working in the area of development of the girl child, and was the director of Women's Studies Center at Delhi University, involved in the counseling of women. She's represented India in many international fora that deliberated on women's empowerment and development issues, and has participated as a keynote speaker and resource person in many workshops nationally and internationally, including 8 universities in Canada. She participated in the UN Conference on Human Rights in Vienna, Beijing, and the Beijing +5 conference in New York, and has presented reports on women in politics to UNESCO. It's a privilege for us to have Professor Sushila Kaushik with us today. Professor Kaushik, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Shobana. And thank you, Mr. Venkatraman, for calling me here and giving me the opportunity to listen to Sashi. For the simple reason, it's good to have men. When you have anything on women, it's good to have men. And it's nice if you have 50% men. So I'm very happy the whole thing has been initiated by these 2 speakers. And the topic which really bothers all of us, a very daily question, routine question, which most of us have it, of all this work which we have done for centuries now in this country, not merely after independence, but even before independence, by very many people, has it really lifted the women in their status? So that's the question which we are facing today, or posing today. Namely, the women empowerment movements, has it in any way made any impact on the status of the women from the poorer families or low income groups, or not so well educated? Well, that's a very common perspective. But I would like to go beyond that a little bit to see whether first what is meant by status. The question which you are asking is, has it lifted the status of the women? And when we say the status, we also believe that this status is very often measured in all our textbooks, in our academics, as our statistics persons, as a part of our developmental benefits. We have done so much development over the past 50 years, ever since we became independent, or past 70 years. Where are we now? Where were we in 1947 or 50, the first census? Where are we now in 2002, one census, which will come up soon? This is one way of measuring. I'm putting the word measuring within quotes. One way of measuring how much the status of women have increased in the past so many years. But and this talks in terms of certain indicators, like you have education indicator or employment indicator or even income indicator and many other things. And then say that this many women have it, this many women have not had it. They have. You also have internationally acclaimed in the indicators like human development indicator, gender development indicator, and of late, under the influence or impact of the feminist studies, you also have gender equality indicator, which is much more value oriented than the other two, which are more statistics oriented. So we have all these various indicators which talk immediately to us or give us immediately an idea about the status of women where we are now. And we believe that that is the status. Is that the status? Because quite a lot of this particular word status of women has come to us because the very first equality report which we accepted, which we adopted in the beginning when we started the Towards Equality report, you find that the word used is status of women in India. All over the world, status of women, status of women. So we believe that is the indicator. It is really not, because status is a word which is much more value loaded than just being a statistical indicator. So when we think in terms of status, then we get into this question. In spite of all these various developments, I don't want to believe that India has not developed. I can't agree that nothing has happened in the past 70 years. Definitely various indicators, developmental indicators tell you more girls are going into schools, enrollment has improved, more girls are going into colleges, more girls are going into science and technology stream than ever before. The UGC tells you the data which is there to say that more and more women are becoming engineers, aeronautical engineers, pilots. You can have very many types of indicators from which you can do it. And you find that over a period of time, gradually, but not really in a very fast way, Indian women have improved themselves and their positions. But does that mean Indian women have really become developed? Does this mean that these development indicators are going to tell us Indian women are empowered? We're talking in terms of Indian empowerment movement. How many of our movements in this country is meant towards empowerment of women? Does development and empowerment the same, or do they totally differentiated? If you have development, we can have a little empowerment, as all the speakers said, as Mr. Sashi also said right now. So much of development has taken place, but does this mean we have empowered our women? Women from poorer families, women, when we get every day an instance in the newspaper, she topped IAS, she topped this, she went there, she got this fellowship from Harvard, and all of them are from very, very poor families. But does this mean they are empowered? So we very often identify empowerment with development. And that's why most of the movements in India, I'm one of those who are participating in it for the past 50 years. Even then, I'm ready to point out that most of the movements which have taken place in India, most of the activities done by our NGOs are in the field of development, not in the field of empowerment. The two have to be distinguished because There are people who are very empowered but may not be developed. He gave the example right now of Tara Shinde. There are lots of Tara Shindes in our country who, even today in Rajasthan and other places, if you go to the tribal regions of India, you still find very many women talk, very articulate, ready to fight a battle, and say things which they want to say in very open terms without being scared of what's happening around. So you find that the empowerment is a very different concept from development. Without empowerment, your development couldn't have taken place. A lot of women who were empowered, who could talk in parliament or elsewhere, could have brought about the development. A lot of women have to be developed in order that they can acquire some amount of empowerment. So the most important part of the word empowerment is the power. The 5-digit word POWER is the most important part of the empowerment. How many of us have worked for the empowerment of women? If you do not have the empowerment of women, any amount of your development indicators going up or any amount of your government initiating reforms, any amount of your laws and legislations for women, including the Domestic Violence Act, which I think I consider this as a very far-reaching act, cannot be of any use. You can make an act. You can have a judiciary which gives you a judgment in favor of a woman who goes there. But does the benefit of it reach all the women of India or any woman of India who requires it and use? For which you need some other dosage of a thing, and not just development, just the legislations, just the judicial pronouncements, but you require something more than that. That's what we call empowerment of women. What is power? In this context, if you say empower, and power is the most important word in that empowerment, then what is power? Power is the capacity to influence a decision. It may be in the home, it may be in the public sphere. It may be in the public domain of politics, or it may be public domain of your office or workplace. Power is your capacity to influence. Does the woman have the power to influence? It's a capacity to make a decision, influence others to make a decision, influence others not to make a decision, influence others to modify a decision, or empower yourself to make your own decisions. How many women in this country can make their own decisions? How many women in our public places can make decisions? This is where one of the most important, you referred to Beijing Platform of Action. One of the most important aspects of those platforms was women in decision making. The women are not in any decision making position, either at home or in workplaces or in politics or in economics or in the big private industries. How do they make that position empowered enough to influence others? That is where many of us really believed, and I believe, one of the most important decisions we ever made in our country in the past so many years, 2 decisions. One, the right to vote. Nehru made it. Nehru made it with a far-reaching sight. Doesn't matter if they are poor. Doesn't matter if they are rural. Doesn't matter if they are totally illiterate. Doesn't matter if they cover their head with parda, burqa. What we have to draw is bring the women into the public place. And there is a saying in Gopal's book on biography of Nehru, that Nehru was delighted and had tears in his eyes when he saw the poor women sitting on a reda or sitting on a bullock cart, traveling a lot of distance before coming to vote in 1951-52 first elections. The political empowerment, the second important step which he took was the 72nd, 73rd Amendment of the Constitution, namely Panchayat Raj. They took amendments to our local government, but Panchayat Raj and municipality, particularly Panchayat Raj, because municipality anyway is located in the urban areas, women are little exposed, but in the rural areas, the impact is Panchayati Raj and the reservation for women and giving them the seat to sit in the panchayats, and with or without a burqa, with or without a veil, doesn't matter. Those are only outer distinction, but actually make her sit there. I happen to be interested in this field so much that I went all over India. I've been to very many villages in very many backwards in states like UP, Rajasthan, Uttarakhand. I have seen women really talking to me about what impact this Panchayat Raj has made on them. Getting them a position in Panchayat, allowing them to go out of the house, giving them strict hours of work to be there, has made women do a lot of sacrifices at home, but then she enjoyed it. That gave her tremendous amount of power. That gave us tremendous amount of self-image. What women really require is a self-image. A self-image that I am capable of something, I am there, I have the power, I can go out of the house, I can talk to the men, I can say what I want to say in a public forum. I have subsequently visited as well as heard a lot of women coming into various workshops. And the one thing India has done in the entire world women's movement is this particular political empowerment of women, this particular reservation for women in local, and thousands and lakhs of women participating in political decision. So the important stuff for women is the power to make decisions, the power to sit at the top and make decisions. That it doesn't matter which women we are talking about. See, making a distinction between women who come from the richer families, developed families, and women who come from lower income groups cuts the point only up to a particular extent. Women are a homogeneous group. It's a homogeneous body. Doesn't matter where we come from, how educated you are, how not so well educated you are, still the basic problems remain the same. The phenomenon of powerlessness. For instance, I will give an instance to a couple who were both doctors, studied together, employed in a very good hospital in Delhi. The woman committed suicide. She was a doctor. He was also a doctor. The reason? Dowry. So the dowry is a phenomenon which immediately reflects on your status within the household. It shows to you how much power you have in the household. Dowry may be many other reasons, economic and others, but basically it shows your status is that of an inferior being to the status of the other person. So you have to give dowry. The other person doesn't give you dowry, right? So the power position, the hierarchical position, which we are all made to live in the society, is the most important. To me, family is a political institution. There are very many, I've been opposed by many and I've been fighting with many. Family is a political institution. It's a power-based institution. It's a hierarchical institution. There, nobody is equal to anybody. It's a highly, what I'll finally call a patriarchal institution. There, the man is definitely at the higher level than the woman. The power concept, why is it there are problems with mother-in-law and daughter? This is another question which keeps coming up. That once again it's an issue of power. Once again it's an issue of hierarchy. The mother-in-law has a power position which is much higher than that of the daughter-in-law. So when she tries to exercise her power, when she becomes a mother-in-law, as a daughter-in-law, she has suffered a lot on this. So power within the family, and family being, state being an extension of the family, as sociologists will think. The state reflects the same. So you find whether you go to a school, whether you go to a sports field, whether you go to an office, wherever you go, there is a power position, written and unwritten. The written may be the CEO and others, you can give designation. But the unwritten part of it is a man. There is this social norm which has made the man to be superior in these various things. Every institution ultimately comes where their power lies. If you do not have that empowerment there, then all your developmental benefits has no meaning. You may be a PhD, you may be a doctor, you might have done anything, you may be a CEO, but when you come home, what's your position? When a doctor comes home, what does she do first? Throws her handbag this way, changes her dress, gets into the kitchen, And if somebody else is also arriving along with you, like your husband, make the tea and give it to you. Right? So there, once you enter the household, your position is very clearly inscribed. You will know where you are. This really upsets all this. So that is where, in a way, uh, this distinction between low income groups, women from lower classes and women from higher classes doesn't hold good beyond a particular point. All the developmental thing which you have done to me is external. There is no development which has taken place inside me to be empowered enough to overcome my external situations. That's where development and the empowerment are two different words, but one without the other is not. So many suicides which is taking place, especially these days, because of young girls doing it, is aspirational suicide. That is, they have aspirations, they've developed aspirations because you expose them to development. They've been to the school, they've read the books, they've seen the movies, they've read the novels, and they also cultivate for themselves a certain self-image, a self-aspiration, a goal, a target. They're not able to reach it. Is the reason only the economic, or the reason is sociological? The reason is social. From the beginning, when you were born, what she has written about it is, from the beginning you were born, you are treated as a second-grade citizen. You are never treated as equal. And as you go along, this socialization process continues. When it reaches a higher level, the society has developed a certain amount of vestiges, power and vested interest in keeping the women subordinated. That's what you call social construction of gender. You construct the women and construct the gender in such a way that the society can benefit out of it. When you try to shake, the society refuses to be shaken, and so the society still tries to reinforce. That's where comes the violence. The enormous amount of violence which is going on right now, or which was there from the very beginning the world came into being, is mainly because the women try to shake the society, try to change the society, try to put somewhere here something which sounds to the society is doing, which will shake the society and change the society, which they do not want. There's a lot of resistance to change. And when, especially you resist the change when you are the beneficiary of the existing system. If the status quo is going to benefit you, why allow a change? What women are trying to make it is trying to be change makers, trying to change not merely for themselves, but for the society itself, which is misusing the power and resources of women, which is wasting the power and resources of women over a period of time, to change it. Change is something which the existing social setup does not want. Society basically is conservative. And that is where comes the violence. The violence really reflects on not merely the physical power of the man over the woman, the masculinity concept, which boys particularly have it. The masculinity concept is something which many people are trying to break, but is not succeed. Even a man who is, when he is young and aspirational and has very many ambitions and understands all this, by the time he comes to a certain stage in his life, begins to show his masculinity. So that concept is something which the social construction really nourishes, because it doesn't want that concept to change. Any equality, gender equality, when you talk about, that masculinity has to be rubbed and demolished. That comes from what you call most fundamental concept which we in women's studies have, is the patriarchy. As Mr. Shashi said, unless you change the mindset. Mindset of whom? Mindset of men, mindset of women. Over a period of time, the socialization has done so much harm, even to women's mindset. With the result, you have to change the mindset of both, the behavioral pattern of both, the thinking process of both. Then only you will ever have what the United Nations has started or anybody has started as gender equality index. The gender equality index is more or less the similar in all parts of the world, because that is where the, as you said, this is a universal concept. Patriarchy is a universal. The rich and the poor. You may be a very rich man's daughter-in-law. You may be having enormous amount of gold and silken sarees to wear and go about. Status is not merely a developmental indicator. Status is something which talks in terms of the power which you have. To me, that particular experiment which we did in 72nd, 73rd, not merely brought women, but it brought women into a holistic type of an empowerment. House to house, you go to villages. Community to community, go in the villages. See the community. The amount of knowledge it brought to the women, the amount of confidence it brought to the women, was something which, unfortunately, we are losing. We lost it because our political dispensation has not encouraged or not positively nurtured this particular enlightenment which came about after the 73rd Amendment. For some time, for about 5 to 10 years, the trainee, talking to them, counseling them if they have problems with this particular notion of women coming into decision. What you are seeing in COVID is exactly the same. COVID, work from home are concepts which sound, especially work from home concept, sounds very great. In the beginning, women were extremely happy. They're all very happy. I don't have to dress up in the morning and go. I can be as I am. I don't have to worry about hanging in the bus or. And now I can do it all relaxed. What happened? The work from home concept. Women began specializing in making cooking dishes. Women began, whatever little skills they had, they were trying to specialize. Even if they didn't have any skill, most of the women spent that time in household chores rather than really increasing their skills, public skills. So I do not consider work from home is a very great concept. It's something which pushes you into lockdown. It pushes you into the family. It reinforces your family roles. It reinforces once again the power structure within the family. You have been a girl. It removes you from public space. It removes you from talking to others. It removes you from socializing with others. It removes you from earning more skills. So to me, work from home concept, maybe I'm a person who will get into a debate on this, but it is a concept which is not ultimately in the interest of, unless we know how exactly you utilize it. Most of us don't know how to utilize it because the socialization which has gone into us, our own self-image is not powerful enough to push us forward. So empowering oneself is the most important thing. You know, the word, when you say political empowerment, it looks like an outside concept. Somebody is coming and empowering you. Somebody is giving you development which you are empowering. Somebody is giving you some sort of, no, empowerment is a self-nourishing concept. The women have to have the empowerment for which they have to come out of the socialization processes to which they have been subjected to from the time they are 7 days old. When they give you a name, when you give a certain thing, at that time you are castigated as you are a woman, you are a man. And that continues till the life ending affairs. And that is where the role which both external factors and internal factors will have to make. And in a way, I can say that the women whom I found in the villages when you give a chance, they're much more empowered than the women from the urban middle classes. It's a fact. Urban middle classes women have all these conservative, traditional socialization practices. The women from the tribal communities, the women from the agricultural community, because they have been working from the beginning. Working not merely at home, working also outside. Working even at home with agricultural stuff. Half of the agricultural activities are performed at home, and that is cattle feeding, food making, and weeding, willowing, all these various agricultural practices women have been doing, for which they have gone out of the house to do it. So women in the house, men outside is a concept which only Westerners have it. We didn't have it. We still don't have it. If you go into the hill areas of India, even now you find the men come away to the cities, the women are looking after the agriculture. Whether it's Uttarakhand, whether it's the Northeast, or whether Himachal, wherever you go, you find women are looking after the land throughout the year. And men come in only at certain times of the year. So it's not that women have been at home all along in all parts of India. That's why the Indian women do not constitute one type of a homogeneous group. For that matter, Black women. For that matter, African women. For that matter, women in Manila or Southeast Asia or Thailand. The women have been all along working. So calling them as unemployed is a concept which is coming from men, not from women. Most of the time, our books have been written, our concepts have been enunciated, our words have been invented, or have been by those who have been socialized in patriarchal model, patriarchal thinking. That's why you say women are not employed. Women are not developed. Lots of people, sociologists, anthropologists, have questioned the whole notion of women not being developed, women not being, they may not be literate, but they are developed. They may not get a chance to show their power and skill, but they are empowered. They have the power. So I found in many cases, the village women challenging the chief ministers directly in their face and telling us, do this for us, for our community, for our village. I want this for my village. But for that, the women have to be in a position where they can decide their choices, what is good for their village, where should a pipe be located, where should a nala be done. This sort of decisions, nobody consults the women. Women have no chance to say it, because the one place from where women have been really deprived of is the decision making. And decision making doesn't mean 1/3 women in panchayat. It could be even 50% women, even 70% women. Nobody gave us the proportion. The logic of the legislation, perhaps, judiciary perhaps gave 1/3. Reality could be much, much more than 1/3. We are stuck to 1/3 as a ceiling. Whether it is board meetings, boards of big companies, government is now making the compulsory one, you say 1/3. 1/3 is no mantra. It can be much more than 1/3, because we need women's thinking, women's experience, and women's skill in making the decisions of the country, decisions of the villages, decisions of the community, decisions of the house. Ultimately, it is the family, is the house, which has to change so that the nation can change. The mindset can change. And I agree with Shashi when he said that as much men have to be drawn into this as women have to be drawn into this. Most of our training for women in this country has taken place without men. I have been to so many panchayat training workshops, but we only call for women. We have so many women studies workshops, we only call women. Men don't turn up even if you call them, because they say, these are women are doing male matching. But the whole issue is, unless the men go through the same type of discussions and debates and listen to both sides, point out what is perhaps wrong in the others, you cannot reach it. So involving the men will mean, in all these activities, would mean bringing about a different socialization process, different mindset in whatever way. So the Panchayat Raj was a good experiment. give a couple of one example where the mindset is moved. There was a police officers training workshop, and I was asked to talk on that. I talked about Domestic Violence Act. They just come in at that time. So I was explaining the domestic violence, and I was very busy, very decently trying to explain it to the police officers. What is domestic, whatever, possible domestic violence. But ultimately, he subsequently became the IG of police in UP. He got up and said, "What do you expect me to do? Peep through the bedroom of the husband, whether he's violating her rights?" That's the sort of a reaction you get from them. Rather than seeing the truth of it, they try to find fault with this. When we gave Panchayati Raj in the very beginning, the men tried to bring their mothers, 65-year-old woman, 80 years old woman who doesn't even know how to read and write, because the men were displaced by women. 1/3 of the seats were displaced by women, so they tried to bring their mothers. They'll come along with the mother, sit behind the mother, things like this, tell the decision. Later on, when it moved a bit, they began bringing the wives. Wife will listen to him because the patriarchy at home continues into Panchayati Raj also. So with the man around there sitting next to you, I'll come with you. Woman can never feel free, right? And that is where the patriarchy makes inroads into everything. But as we went along, 1 or 2 elections took place. The young women, the educated women, the graduate women came into the panchayats. One panchayat chairman said, "I will not bring my daughter, I will only bring my daughter-in-law into this panchayat, in my place." Why? Daughter-in-law will stay with me. She will be in my village. She will represent. The daughter will go away and she will not listen to me. So I don't want daughters to come in. So the distinction goes on in every type of a thinking which you have. And to me, the panchayat was a great experience because that really showed where the women stood and where the women can move, what their aspirations were. And once you give them the chance of empowering them to be in a decision-making position, what decisions could they make? What knowledge they could acquire? People used to say they don't know auditing, they don't know how to make planning. No, they did much better than anybody could do. So that's where I think changing the mindset is the biggest instrument. How to change it? What all the various, we have all the social media which can help us to change it. We have all the other types of media which can help us to change it. It will take time. Our schools will have to change. Our teachers will have to change, men or women. Our teachers carry such a strong conservative patriarchal in their attitude in their head. Lots of young girls came to me and said once when I went to village, "Ma'am, please talk to our principal." I said, "What?" "We want football." They gave us a carom board. "We don't want carom board. We want to play football." This happened in Gadwal. I had to talk to the principal, and the principal first refused, gave me all types of reasons why only one football I have to give to the boy, things like this. But ultimately, he had to give in and give a football to the girls, and they had to have a women's squad. So the aspirations of the girls, the skills of the girls, the capacity of the girls are not being utilized in this country. Now it has taken centuries before we can have a hockey team, cricket team, football team, not even football team, from among the women. So there is a sort of a parda, there's a sort of a corridor, there's a sort of something which needs to be changed. And that change has to come from others, that change has to come from men, that change has to come from women, and above all, it has to come from within. So the movement of empowerment which we are all doing outside are only catalysts. They only enable or give you some information. So we cannot expect the women's movement to bring the empowerment of others. We cannot have the women empowerment to bring about the development of others. It has to be something which has to come in, and it has come in quite a lot. It has come in India. So I will not be pessimistic enough saying there has been no change in the past 70 to 80 years after the independence, the state, as you call, quote and unquote, status of women. It is going up little by little, but it is not going that fast as we want to have. And it's not merely India. Appearances are not real. Just because you see a Western woman dressed up in a different way, talking in a different way, standing next to a man in a different way, you cannot presume their empowerment. Ultimately, their women's movement is strong, started in the West, in the recent times. Moved to West Asia. It's a very big scholars in West Asia who have written against the feudal system of the West Asian princes and principalities and emirates, and you find them there. You find Africans fighting hard, hear their music. You find the Black Americans. They have the best and the most voracious type of women who can compose very powerful songs in the same way as we have in our country music, in our village music, in our folk music, in our folk practices. You find them also having. So this is not merely a universal phenomenon. It is all the empowerment movement is also universal. People have been fighting hard. People are making effort, but it's very strong. It's very strongly faced with the challenge of what you call patriarchy. And that patriarchy will not go unless the patriarchy benefits from the existing society, and patriarchy existing from the existing system, a systemic change, you have to call it, or a different socialization process, and a different way of looking at society, what society can come up as is needed before you can think in terms of even shaking this patriarchy. And the focal point has to be men. The focal point has to be young men who grow to be old and carry the same values with them even when you become old. Right? One's experiences helps an older man to understand this, but the younger men don't seem to understand this. Equality is equality between men and men of the same ages, not between an old man who understands after life's experiences that he has not been very nice to his wife when he was young. And now he is able to see the daughter-in-law, how she is being treated. Then the justice comes out. An old man who finds that he has not given enough to his daughter. And now when she suffers at the old age, either he changes himself or he changes the daughter. Many of them are ready to change. So that's some justice is coming in by a back door, but the justice is not coming fully open from the front door. So don't expect development to bring about empowerment or empowerment automatically to bring about the development, but the empowerment policies, empowerment practices, empowerment social activities have to be kept in view and see where the women can be empowered. Whatever means is required, women need to be empowered. Women are not empowered as yet, even if appearances look different. I may look different, you may look different, but then can we assure ourselves and others that we are empowered ourselves and we have empowered other women to be equal? And equality is a concept which still requires tremendous amount of work from our side. Can I finish it now? It's, I don't know, I didn't see that. Thank you so much, Shobhana.
Thank you very much, Professor Kaushik. That was indeed enlightening. I'll now request Sri Venkatraman to address any questions that we've received from the audience to our speakers.
I think it was a very powerful talk by both the senior and extremely eminent speakers. I think it appears to have provoked people to think on the subject. I have a number of queries which is coming into my mailbox. I will take only two questions because of want of time. One for Mrs. Shashi Nair, one for Professor Shiva Kaushik. I'll take the question to Mrs. Shashi Nair first. One of the questions that has been raised is, has media played an adequate role in empowering women in India? I exactly read out the query that has been written to me here. When women in the lower income group suffer from atrocities, the media project it as a breaking news and as a matter of sensation and then forget it. Should media be blamed for belittling the issue in such a manner instead of taking the fight for liberation of women to a logical end? This is a question that has been raised by somebody, Mrs. Shashi Nair. Would you like to say anything on it?
Yes. Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes.
Can you hear me?
We can
Yeah.
hear you.
Yeah. All right. Yeah, that's a valid point. I mean, there's no disagreement on that. I wouldn't disagree at all. As I mentioned earlier, whether it's newspapers, of course, news websites, at least of repute, are slightly different today. Newspapers generally have lack of space, but even otherwise, there are certain aspects that go into getting news out, into publishing news. So things like immediacy, prominence, and things like that. So whenever there's an incident that is of some magnitude, newspapers or journalists will report. But there is no doubt, thanks mainly to the television age that started probably 20 years ago, and now it's going headstrong, that newspapers too, at some points, have tended to sensationalize, some of these happenings. That is number one. They don't sensationalize it as much as television does, in the sense that it's not a 24/7 thing that goes on and on. But the more important point that has been mentioned is there is very little follow up on something that has been reported unless it is a developing story that holds some magnitude. One of the reasons could be that, unlike in earlier years, when the standards of journalism were far higher, there are fewer reporters today because of the cost cutting measures and things like that. For example, we don't have an agriculture correspondents are not there anymore. Even the Hindu doesn't have one, I think. And even if you are an agriculture correspondent, you're supposed to report on happenings that I mean, you have press releases or you have press conferences or you cover the minister or the ministry, but you don't cover farmer suicides or you don't go and talk to farmers. So there's a difference there. But now with jobs you're going away, and there are several cost-cutting measures, not just because of COVID, but even earlier, several people have lost jobs in the media. So you have a scene where you could be a health reporter, but because of lack of enough reporters, you might be even asked to go and cover something else. At least temporarily. So reporters are driven by what editors want. So even if there is a reporter who's done the story and wants to revisit and do a follow-up, the editor may say, okay, forget it, we've already reported it, what's the big deal? So I think there is no disagreement on this point. The onus again lies on the reporter to push it forward and to pitch it and to push it forward. And if you have, an editor who sort of understands this well, he might give some space for a follow-up. But that in today's world is a little difficult to expect. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you, Mr. Shinhaya. I have a question for Professor Sushila Kaushik. It is a very strange question. What I will just read out what this gentleman has written. Professor Sushila Kaushik makes a difference between development and empowerment. It's okay as far as it goes. But there is a basic factor. The empowerment of women is becoming difficult because every woman seems to be against every other woman. For example, you were saying your daughter-in-law suffers at the hands of a mother-in-law. When the daughter-in-law becomes mother-in-law herself, she behaves exactly the same way as the mother-in-law behaved with her. So it is possible that women are against women itself. How do you answer this, Professor Sushila Kaushik?
Well, this is a question which keeps coming up essentially from a patriarchal mind. Because this is usually the question which the men put across to women when they have to defend themselves. Putting the blame on the women and then say, not only we are patriarchal, but the question is concept of power. It's not mother-in-law, daughter-in-law, or any in-law. It's a question of power. Power is lacking for women, which she is wanting to have in order to make decisions or influence decisions. If she doesn't get it when she is young. As she gets older, she gets that power to make the decision. She is in a position where she can influence the decision. So then she uses that power to make the decision, whether it's against a daughter-in-law or against anybody else. So this is a question of lack of empowerment of the mother-in-law. It's a lack of empowerment of the daughter-in-law, both. because it's not a question of the status of a mother-in-law or the status of this. And in a village and in a family, that's why I said a family is a hierarchical institution. It is based on power. It is based on this hierarchy, who is higher, who is lower. It is not an equal institution at all. That way, it's a political institution. Family is a political institution, as political scientists would call it. So when you look at it at that angle, then you won't put this sort of a question as to she is treating so and so, this one is treating so and so. There are cases on the other side also we can have it. But the issue is one of the lack of power, and when you get the power, how you use it, that is the issue. So from the beginning, if you are not having a power, you wait for a day when you get the power to influence the decisions. Empowerment is the reason, lack of empowerment is the reason.
Would you justify, Professor Sushila Kaushik, would you justify a daughter-in-law behaving like a mother-in-law when she becomes a mother-in-law?
It's not a question of justifying anything. I don't justify a man behaving like that to a woman. So why should I justify a woman behaving to a woman like that? Issue is not one of justification. It's only an explanation. It's only an explanation as to why then the denial of a power has suddenly been reversed. So then you use the power. So if all along, if you have a good self-image and you have a power and you have exercised in the correct way whenever you have to make the decisions of the family, you won't get into that position of somebody who has been denied and now misused.
Thank you, Professor Sushila Kaushik. I'm sorry I'm not able to take up several other questions, mainly because of the constraints in time. And I over to Ms. Shobhana Vaidyanathan.
Thank you. So a very heartfelt thanks to our speakers today, Professor Sushila Kaushik, Sri Shashi Nair, and also to Sri N.S. Venkatraman for sharing their insights and making this a very informative and thought-provoking session for all of us. Some of the points that really resonated with me, the story of Tarabai Shinde. I certainly plan to pick up that book and read it. That Sri Shashi Nair mentioned how COVID has actually amplified many of the problems that many of the marginalized women have already been facing, and how the solution is probably in changing the mindset of people in the family. This is both men and women, and how inculcating some moral and ethical values right from the start at a very young age in both boys as well as girls, in such a way that we're able to give girls and then women freedom to make decisions and to realize their potential is probably one way out, to be able to empower women. And from Professor Sushila Kaushik's talk, the takeaway that I had was the difference, and something that I never realized. The difference between development and empowerment of women, how development is a very external phenomenon and how empowerment is something which is so internal. And that really makes a huge difference as to what is the status of the women. The capacity to influence, the capacity to make a decision, and how the right to vote as well as Panchayati Raj were two monumental happenings in our history, which gave women the ability to make that decision and empowered women. Another thing which really resonated with me was that, how women across, financial strata are actually a very homogeneous group, and how the concept of patriarchy, which is a social gender concept, is actually entrenched across economic strata, which actually gives women their status in the family, and how family is actually the basic unit of politics, and extends to the political life and to the public life of women, from there. And the participation, according to me, which I totally agree, participation of women in economic activity gives them the empowerment, along with political participation, like what would have happened in the case of Panchayati Raj. The ability to actually voice their power, whether politically, financially, this has nothing to do with literacy, is something that I completely agree with. It really resonated with me. And I think that is something that can be inculcated in women from a very young age, to aspire to be independent financially, to aspire to be independent in their thinking and decision making, is something that is probably what all of us can really participate in. And the last takeaway was, I think, one of the most important, which is how participation of men in everything that we talk about women. We cannot be what we want to be without the other half participating fully in making that happen. Is something which is very, very crucial if we want to achieve anything as far as women's empowerment goes. So, a very, very enlightening evening for me. I'd like to thank everyone who's joined us this Saturday evening, and close with a quote by Hillary Clinton. Nations that invest in women's employment, health, and education are just more likely to have better outcomes. Their children will be healthier and better educated. So this is not just the right thing to do for us to hold up these women, to support them, to encourage their involvement. This is a strategic imperative. Thank you very much.